Motion number 2 on payment scheme. I call the Minister to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that the committee consider the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme Regulations 2024. And let us start by reminding ourselves why we are here today. The infected blood scandal is a mark of shame on the British state. The Infected Blood Inquiry's final report, published on the 20th of May, shed light on the trauma inflicted on thousands of people across the country through no fault of their own. People were given contaminated blood or blood products and contracted HIV, hepatitis C and hepatitis B, and then for years had their voices ignored. Those who were affected, the people who loved and knew and cared for someone who was infected, similarly had their voices ignored too. This did nothing but compound the trauma of all involved. The Infected Blood Inquiry's second interim report, published in 2023, set out 18 recommendations on compensation, informed by Sir Robert Francis KC's 2022 Compensation Scheme study. The inquiry was unequivocal that a compensation scheme must be set up immediately. And the regulations that we are debating today are essential for delivering that compensation scheme and getting money to people as quickly as we can. When the now Prime Minister and I responded to Sir Brian Langstaff's inquiry in May, we were absolutely clear that one of the most powerful conclusions in his report is that an apology is meaningful only if it is accompanied by action. Today, with these regulations and this compensation scheme, we are delivering that action and taking another step on the road to justice that has been so cruelly delayed. I will give way.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. My constituent, Alex Robinson, lost her father to this scandal in 2006, having been his carer since the age of 13. In her own words, he never got to walk me down the aisle or hold his grandchildren. She's incredibly concerned about getting justice. Can the Minister confirm that she will, along with all other families, receive legal support to ensure they can make their application to the compensation scheme successfully?
Well, I'm very grateful for that intervention, and I'm sure that the whole House would join me in expressing their sympathies with the situation that his constituent and their family has been through. Now, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will aim to ensure that appropriate advice and support is available to assist people with managing their compensation awards, accessing financial services, and also accessing benefits advice where relevant to. One moment. Sir Robert Francis KC recommended in his report that legal support is available to people who want to claim compensation. The Government and I have accepted that recommendation, and we will work with the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to develop that package of support services. And I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Minister, for giving way. One of the recommendations in the report was that charities and support organisations that provide advice to victims and their families should be placed on a statutory funding basis. Can the Minister confirm that it is the Government's intention to implement this recommendation?
With regard to, if I understand the honourable gentleman's intervention correctly, what he's talking about are the different organisations that already exist. Now, of course, we will consider all the different recommendations in the round, but he is absolutely right to highlight their role because it is hugely important. And I know that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will look to work with those different support organisations, which I think is absolutely vital. Now, the scheme is based on the recommendations and principles put forward by the inquiry. In line with these, Madam Deputy Speaker, and supported by the advice from the inquiry response expert group, it was then updated following the engagement exercise Sir Robert Francis KC undertook in June with victims and indeed representatives of the infected blood community. And the government has sought to design a fair and comprehensive compensation scheme, but one that is also quick and simple for eligible applicants to access. Now, we'll first turn to eligibility. The scheme and these regulations define people who are eligible as infected people in line with recommendation 2 of the inquiry's second interim report. This covers people infected with HIV, hepatitis C and hepatitis B, and it includes people directly infected by treatment with blood, as well as people indirectly affected via transmission from a directly infected person. Secondly, the regulations establish a core route for claiming compensation as an infected person. The core route provides compensation under 5 awards or categories or heads of loss, as set out in recommendation 6 of the inquiry's report. And these are an injury impact award, a social impact award, a care award, a financial loss award, and an autonomy award. Together, these will comprise the total compensation award to be given to infected individuals or to the estates of any deceased infected individuals to recognise the wide-ranging harm resulting from their infection. Now, earlier this year, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Victims and Prisoners Act established the Infected Blood Compensation Authority in law to deliver the scheme. And I'm proud to have campaigned with many members from across this House to have delivered that change in legislation. And I do pay tribute as well to the Right Honourable Gentleman for Salisbury for his role. And I'm proud that this government is now delivering on that commitment. With these regulations, we are providing the authority with the legal powers they need to start making payments. The regulations also provide further detail on how the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will accept applications and pay awards. Now, I know that the authority under Sir Robert Francis' chairmanship has been working hard to design and implement effective, simple and secure processes that put the infected blood community at the heart of their work. Last week, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority reached out to the very first claimants under the scheme. The authority is taking a test and learn approach which will ensure they can take on board feedback and improve the service before it opens its full compensation scheme. Now, I hope that step provides confidence that we are absolutely committed to driving forward progress to meet our shared intention of beginning payment by the end of this year, which I've previously said to the House. And I will do everything in my power to ensure that all those who are entitled to compensation receive it as soon as possible. Now, I will reflect from... I will give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Minister, and may I commend the way in which he's handling this obviously very sensitive matter. He's got the tone just right. On behalf of a constituent, Mr A, who was infected by being born of a mother who was infected, I've corresponded with Sir Robert Francis KC on my constituent's behalf. If he were here, he'd be keen to know that the compensation scheme will cover people in his circumstances, both for their physical and mental distress. For the avoidance of doubt, could the Minister just confirm that those people will be covered by the scheme as well, please?
Yes, and first of all, let me just, I'm sure I speak for everyone in the House, express my sympathies to his constituent and indeed their family. And he's entirely right to raise that case directly with Sir Robert Francis. I know members, I would say to members across the House actually, to look up the details of the Infected Blood Compensation Authority on the gov.uk website. The details indeed are there, and when they are dealing with constituents, both to point them in that direction, the authority is already setting out newsletters, but also to do as the Right Honourable Gentleman has done and to write directly to the authority. But clearly, on the basis of someone infected where it's been transmitted from his mother, he clearly fits under the category of an infected person under the scheme, and he is precisely the kind of person the scheme is designed to help, and he's right to come and raise that case on the floor of this House today and in this debate. I'll give way to...
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. This has been a long journey for the people who've been affected by this scandal, and that's exactly what it has been. Can you just clarify the issue that has been raised around inheritance tax, given that many of these payments will be paid to possibly very elderly payments, and the kind of second generation recipients are worried about the issue of inheritance tax? Will this be exempt from that, and is that possible?
Yes, the awards are exempt from tax. I think it's inheritance tax and indeed capital gains tax, and that's precisely how the scheme has been designed. I hope that gives a reassurance to the honourable gentleman. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will move to the points that were raised by the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, because it is important I do address those. Now, as the committee noted, the infected blood scandal stretches back over many decades, and access to records, particularly medical evidence, is going to be very challenging, and I acknowledge that. And that is at the very heart of the challenge, frankly, as I'm sure honourable and right honourable members will understand, of trying to address an injustice that's been allowed to continue for so many decades. Now, where it is the case, the authority will need to make objective decisions relying on evidence that is available to determine on the balance of probabilities that treatment with infected blood occurred. The authority will, and I expect it to, provide assistance to those who believe their medical records have been lost or destroyed, and evidencing eligibility will be easier, faster and more compassionate than, for example, one would experience through any court proceedings. Now, the committee also highlighted the complexity of the regulations. That is why, alongside the publication of the regulations and the explanatory memorandum, the government published a detailed policy paper in August on how the compensation scheme will operate, setting out what individuals can expect to receive, including case study examples. Additionally, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will ensure that appropriate advice and support is available to assist people in managing their compensation awards, accessing financial services and indeed accessing benefits advice where relevant, as I set out in the earlier intervention to my honourable friend. Thirdly, the committee raised questions on how claimants will receive payments. Now, as set out in recommendation 10 of the Infected Blood Inquiry's second interim report, the regulations include a mechanism for electing for periodic compensation payments or a lump sum. And that's responding, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the wishes of those who've told us that they wanted this option to be available to them. We've also provided an alternative for those currently receiving support scheme payments through the infected blood support schemes. The so-called IBSS route was developed following the recommendations of Sir Robert Francis KC, following his engagement with representatives of the infected blood community. Now, the clearest finding from that engagement, as I say, was around the continuation of the existing support scheme payments. The government has listened, and we have agreed and accepted that support scheme payments will continue for life for those who elect the IBSS route. And the route will be available for those who applied to be registered on a support scheme on or before the 31st of March 2025 and delivered as part of the compensation package. Now, the tariff-based scheme, and this tariff-based scheme, is designed to be fast, fair, consistent and secure. And we hope people will be satisfied. They've been provided with full and fair compensation as the scheme sets out. One moment. However, should that not be the case, the regulations do make provision concerning review of decisions made by the authority and for appeals to the first tier tribunal. And I give way to my honourable friend.
Friend for giving way. Michael in my Runcorn and Helsby constituency will benefit from this action, this compensation. I do commend the Minister and the Government for the swift action here. How do we ensure that maintain trust in terms of the process? Is there an opportunity for victims to review any aspects of the compensation scheme that may not be working in the future?
Yes, and my honourable friend makes a very powerful point about trust in the process going forward. The way the scheme is designed, there is a core route, there is also then a supplemental route that is designed where there are particular issues, for example, around care claims or around financial loss that are not appropriately captured in the core route. But there's also, as I've said, provision around review and indeed appeals to the first tier tribunal, and that is important. But I would also say to my honourable friend that one of the purposes of having a tariff-based scheme is also to try and make it simpler, easier to access, so that the number of subsequent appeals and the need for such appeals is minimised. Now, I know that the House speaks as one when it comes to paying long overdue compensation to those impacted by this harrowing scandal. And following the passing of the Victims and Prisoners Act, these regulations are the next substantial step towards getting money to people who rightly deserve it. But I also recognise that whilst there has been progress, this work is far from finished. A second set of regulations will provide for other elements of the compensation scheme, including compensation payments to those who are affected and for claims outside that core route. Now, subject, of course, to parliamentary approval, I am aiming, and the government is aiming, for the second set of regulations to be in place by the 31st of March 2025 to support our intention and what I've previously said to this House, so that those who are affected can start receiving payments next year. Now, I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there is a shared determination across this House to deliver compensation as swiftly as possible and with the minimum possible delay. And I hope that today, Madam Deputy Speaker, honourable members can agree across the House that these regulations are a significant step towards that.
As on the order paper, I call the Shadow Minister, Mr John Glen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by thanking the Paymaster General for advance notice of the statutory instrument being laid, which he has always done. The Paymaster General rightly reminds the House of the injustice that the victims of the infected blood scandal have been subject to, an injustice that has spanned several decades. But I hope that we are now in rapid delivery mode, and my role is to ensure that the government is doing all it can to deliver compensation as swiftly and effectively as possible for the infected and affected, following the passage of the bill through the House under the previous government. As the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, it is also my duty to work collaboratively with the government on this matter in supporting them and scrutinising them where appropriate. And to that end, I wish to set out some issues raised with me by representatives of the infected and affected communities. But firstly, may I draw his attention again to the second report of the session of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, which found the explanatory memorandum to be overly complex and technical while lacking basic information about the policy. Now, to some extent, Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much sympathise. This is a very complicated matter, and I suspect the Right Honourable Gentleman will agree with me that this critical information should be easily accessible to all. So can the Paymaster General assure the House that he will do everything he can to ensure that the next explanatory memorandum to the second set of regulations will be much clearer in language and in outlining how the policy will work practically? He rightly referred to the detailed policy paper that he published in August with the case studies and the reference to advice and support. But I think the implications of what's been said is that there is an improvement that can be made. On the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, I echo my previous comments in welcoming the government's pledge to deliver the first payments by the end of the year. And I know the Paymaster General and I align in recognising the paramount importance in delivering this compensation as quickly as possible. However, currently, there is no defined timetable on when applications can be made from and when payments will be processed. Furthermore, I know the Paymaster General will find it equally troubling as I do that groups of victims have previously described meeting this end-of-year deadline as nigh on impossible. And trust issues are obviously ones that we need to build up and achieve. Can the Paymaster General outline the steps the Government and the IBCA are taking to ensure that payments will be made by the end of the year, just 10 weeks away? And can he confirm what proportion of the eligible infected community will receive their payments by the end of the year? I'm sensing that there is a suspicion that I'm sure the Paymaster General will be aware that achieving payouts for the previously mentioned user group of 20 individuals by the end of the year will be used to technically satisfy the obligation he made to get money out of the door by the end of the year. But what the infected community as a whole will want to know is that all of them, beyond the 20, will receive their payments in their bank accounts, and what interval between the end of the year and that happening is. Please can the Paymaster General explain how the user group of 20 people have found the new scheme, and how quickly can their lessons be applied to the rest of the infected community? Now, I understand, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the IBCA recently confirmed their intention to invite increasingly larger groups of people to test the service before it opens to those who are eligible. So can the Paymaster General confirm when the scheme will be open to larger groups, how many will be involved? Will this include all victims, including those affected from the infected estates? Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned the issues around burden of proof, and I would also wish to seek clarification on the proof that victims need to provide. It appears that the burden of proof once again falls to victims, and this risks going against the letter and spirit of both Sir Brian Langstaff and Sir Robert Francis's recommendations. Now, I recognise and am sympathetic to the challenges given the Cabinet Office official's advice to me when I was in his position that locating medical records could be an issue given that the latest case date specified in the regulations is more than 30 years ago. So can the Paymaster General outline the decision-making process of the IBCA in circumstances where those medical records are apparently unavailable, and what steps he is taking to ensure that rightful compensation is received when proof of infected conditions is not readily available? Now, I want to move on, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may, to affected persons. In his report in May, Sir Brian Langstaff made abundantly clear that both infected and affected persons were to be given interim payments as quickly as possible. I'm therefore concerned that Part 3 of this instrument defines eligible infected blood persons, but not the affected persons. Can the Minister offer some reassurance to the affected communities and confirm that he has not ignored Sir Brian Langstaff's recommendation for the affected community? They are concerned that the Government's delays in laying the second set of regulations for them means that many elderly parents of infected victims or bereaved partners will not live to see their rightful payouts as affected individuals. And whilst I recognise and acknowledge the drafting and timetable challenges, it will be 10 months from the final report in May this year to the end of March next year without any defined regulations or timetable for making a claim as an affected person. And this will distress many in the affected community. Now, I'm absolutely sure that the Right Honourable Gentleman does not think it is fair for these affected people to feel like second-class citizens, but can he explain what processes will be underway between now and the end of March, and can he look to publish even a broad outline, a timetable for affected communities' applications and their interval before payments will be received? I'm also concerned that there isn't an impact assessment of this SI, and I think parliamentary scrutiny from all sides needs to be balanced, and fairer legislation will ensue if we could have a maximum impact assessment in advance so that evaluation process can be better informed. I know the Minister has previously said the costs of the infected blood scheme will be recognised in the budget next week. Can he confirm whether the government has calculated the impact and cost of the regulations? And I'd like to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by thanking the Honourable Gentleman for his work in this area and his transparency with me. This is very technically challenging and difficult to get right. I have enormous sympathy for him and respect for him. However, I urge him to ensure that critical information is as readily accessible as possible to all victims, infected and affected alike. Bring as much specificity as possible to the timelines for those different communities to this House as quickly as possible, and outline the cost of the scheme. For many of these victims, time is of the essence, which is why we must do all we can to deliver justice as quickly and effectively as possible. I remain committed to supporting the government where I possibly can and asking as reasonable questions as I can where answers still need to be provided. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Jessica Morden.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm really pleased to see these regulations return to the House today. And although there's still much to do, it does mark a significant milestone in ensuring that the government delivers on its promise to work apace to establish the Infected Blood Compensation Authority and to give it the necessary powers to start making the compensation payments. And as other honourable members have said, we do need to do this to ensure that the payments are made as quickly as possible for people who have waited far, far too long for justice already. So I very much also thank the Minister for the urgency with which he has worked to progress this issue to date since coming into government. And I know he will have done so with the many stories of injustice from this long-running scandal in his mind. And he'll know, as my constituency neighbour, that my constituents, the Smiths, lost their son Colin to AIDS, aged just 7 years old. Colin contracted it from infected blood from Arkansas prison, aged just 10 months old, and it emerged during the inquiry that Colin's doctor knew about the infection risks associated with giving the blood treatments to children, but he broke his own NHS department's guidelines to do so anyway. And not only did they lose their very beloved son, but because of the stigma surrounding HIV at the time, the family were ostracised by the local community, harassed, abused, lost employment, and even had AIDS dead written in black paint alongside their house. And that's why we're here today, and that there are so many stories, and that is just why it is so important. When the final report of the Infected Blood Inquiry was published, I said to the now former Minister that the Smiths wanted Colin to be remembered and for sorry to turn into something, into concrete action on compensation without adding further to the decades of painful delay which so many victims have had to endure. So progress is clearly being made, and the Minister will also know that there are many questions that come up along the way. A lot of people are getting their information online, and I would agree with the point that we need more information for those affected families like the Smiths. So on behalf of them, can I just reiterate the point that there is still much confusion amongst the affected community about what the regulations will mean for individual people making their compensation claims. There is a bit of a feeling that compensation for bereaved parents is low, and I think it would be really helpful if more could be done to explain how compensation will be calculated. It's also really important the government engage on an ongoing basis with all those charities involved, as I know the Compensation Authority has done, and we should recognise, as been said, a point made by a colleague from the SNP, about the massively important work those charities have done helping the infected and the affected. And I think it would also, the charities do a fantastic job, but it's also really important to know from today just how families will be individually supported and perhaps offered caseworkers to help them get them through the process. And I'd really be grateful if the Minister could talk a little bit about that. He'll also know that many of those affected, like the Smiths, have waited years for compensation, although it's not just about the compensation, it's about the justice, but that's important too. He's announced previously that applications for interim payments to the estates of deceased infected people will open this month. Can he tell us when that will be be, I know he's talked about that a bit more, but confirm that. He also set out whether affected parents who are not the beneficiaries of an estate will be eligible for those interim payments. The Smiths also understand that those applications should be processed and payments made within 30 days. So if he could address that in his closing remarks, it would be great. As also other members have said, it's clearly a really complicated system and scheme, this, and framework. So it's important today that we acknowledge that and do as much as possible to help people through that process as we can. The Minister also talked about the second set of regulations to enable compensation for the affected. Could the Minister talk a bit more in his closing remarks about the progress being made to this end and when he expects them to be laid and when those estimates, I think he talked about the 31st of March, but that would be helpful as well. And it is vital that once the Infected Blood Compensation Authority begin its work, applications can be swiftly processed without unnecessary delay. So can he reassure people by talking about the resources being made available to do that? So finally, he's obviously aware of the vital work the small charities and support groups continue to do to support those infected and affected like the Smiths. Can I echo the points made by the Honourable Member from the SNP earlier, that their resources have been very stretched hugely in helping people, and it would be really helpful to know what funding might be available for those groups so they continue their important work. So I very much thank the Minister for his important work so far. I hope we have future opportunities to keep raising these issues as we go through those process on behalf of those who've waited just so long for this. We need to get it right, but we also need to get it done.
We have many valuable contributions to be made during the course of this debate. I just want members to be mindful that during the debate on the Infected Blood Payment Scheme, I should remind the House that the Contaminated Blood Products Group litigation is still before the courts. The resolution relating to matters sub judice does not apply when the House is discussing legislation, as we are today, but I would nonetheless invite members to exercise caution and avoid any unnecessary comment on active legal proceedings. I now invite the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Sarah Olney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Liberal Democrats are glad to see the introduction of this legislation and the establishment of the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme. We're glad that this will move the victims of this atrocity, both those infected and affected, closer to long overdue justice and compensation. Victims and their families have been waiting for decades for answers and for recognition of the suffering that they've endured. Liberal Democrats welcome the findings of Sir Brian Langstaff's report, which vindicated so many of those people affected. And we voted last December for the amendment to the Victims and Prisoners Bill, requiring the government to set up the compensation scheme, and we are very glad that this motion establishes that.
Will my honourable colleague give way?
With pleasure.
Thank you. And this is a deeply sad scandal. And would you agree with me that we need reassurance from the Minister that there is adequate capacity to process these applications at pace? Thank you.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and indeed I think that very much comes to the heart of the remarks that I'm going to make about ensuring that the compensation scheme that's being established through this legislation is indeed adequate, not just in its resources but also in its powers to fully address the magnitude of the justice and compensation that is owed to the families who've suffered. So whilst we are grateful that the Government has brought this legislation before Parliament at such an early stage, we want to ensure that these proposals go far enough and ensure that all of those affected get the justice they deserve. And the Liberal Democrats will work with the Government to ensure fair and proper compensation is implemented as quickly and effectively as possible. More than 3,000 deaths are attributable to infected blood and blood products. Over 30,000 people were infected with hepatitis C or HIV after receiving infected blood transfusions, and many thousands more have been affected by the suffering which this has caused. And this scandal is a chilling story of people being failed, not only by the medical professionals who treated them, but by the NHS, who should have been responsible for the safety of their treatment, and by a series of governments whose integrity and diligence should have precluded this kind of atrocity from ever having taken place. Over the course of the decades when this took place, children were subject to unsafe and deeply unethical clinical testing. Senior doctors in British hospitals administered experimental treatments whilst knowing the significant risk of contaminated products, and staff in haemophilia centres across the country used blood products even though it was widely known that these products were likely to be infected, as was so vividly highlighted by the member for Newport West just a minute ago. The scope of the negligence goes far beyond the medical administration. The infected blood inquiry report reveals a culture of covering up, and we must ensure that there is transparency in governance, particularly given the disregard with which the last Conservative government treated the public's trust. Liberal Democrats are supportive of the survivors' call for a duty of candour on all public officials, as well as the introduction of increased legal protections for whistleblowers. And we must do all we can to ensure we have an honest political culture where concerns are listened to and questions answered, so that nothing of this nature can ever happen again. And we are glad that this report has made public the extent to which people were failed, and that there is support from across the House to acknowledge the injustices suffered and which this legislation begins to rectify. And whilst we're grateful for the action of the government in response to Sir Brian's inquiry, particularly the Minister's extension of the scheme beyond the initial commitments from the previous government, we're concerned that this legislation doesn't go far enough. Financial compensation cannot make up for the years of injustice and the unimaginable distress which so many thousands of people have gone through. However, this compensation scheme is an important step in acknowledging their suffering. So I urge the Minister to see this as the first step in the process of compensating victims. We want to see legislation which compensates the children who, without consent, were tested on with contaminated blood yet did not go on to develop a disease. We want to see recognition of family members who witnessed loved ones suffer and in some instances pass away and yet will receive no compensation as they were over the age of 18 at the time that the victim was infected. And we would like to see a clear and explicit explanation of the payment bandings which have been set out, and we want to see engagement with the affected community at all stages. It is vital that the scheme acknowledges the trauma caused beyond the physical suffering caused by the infected blood. Not only were so many lives cut short or destroyed by the hideous physical illnesses that contaminated blood caused, but there has been unimaginable psychological distress caused by experimentation on unconsenting and often unaware patients. And we urge the government to ensure that this scheme encompasses all those who suffered due to the infected blood scandal, and that any further legislation is developed with the close engagement of those who best understand that suffering. Principally, our concerns lie with the transparency of the calculation of compensation payments. It is crucial that this scheme does not establish a hierarchy of suffering, and I ask that the Minister outline the process by which these tariffs were decided. The compensation for people treated with infected blood products who self-cleared hepatitis C is very low and does not account for the health impacts that they have had or the psychological damage that they have experienced. There's also a significant discrepancy between those infected with hepatitis C and those infected with HIV. And whilst we welcome the initiation of compensation payments, we believe there must be greater transparency over how those payments have been calculated. We urge the Minister to engage with the affected communities and ensure that there is clear communication explaining how these decisions have been reached. The complications caused by decades of defensive cover-up have not only exacerbated the trauma experienced by victims, but also affect the estates of those who've died. In the intervening decades, some estates have become contentious, and as such, the rightful recipients of compensation is unclear. In some cases, the compensation could be entailed away from those most impacted by someone's infection or death, and it is vital that the IBCA have the necessary resources and powers to support victims through the process to ensure appropriate compensation is received by all those affected. The burden of the administrative concerns and queries from affected families is currently falling to overstretched charities, and we ask that the Minister, if they have considered the creation of a dedicated unit to deal with inquiries, to work alongside the IBCA. We must support the work of those vital organisations, the charities providing support, and engage with them to understand exactly the needs of those affected. This motion sets out the possibility for future legislation, and we hope that the Government will follow up on this piece of legislation with absolutely vital community engagement. As the scheme progresses, we urge the Government to ensure there are mechanisms in place to ensure the concerns of the charities, organisations and affected individuals are heard. We're cautious of the structural limitations of the IBCA, given the many years over which this scandal took place. The 6-year time frame of the IBCA as a legal entity does not seem sufficient. The equivalent scheme set up by the Irish government in the 1990s is still active, and it is crucial that the IBCA exists for long enough to ensure that the full compensation scheme and associated processes can be carried out effectively. In conclusion, the Liberal Democrats are glad to see the introduction of this legislation. We welcome the government's swift creation of a compensation body, the IBCA, to implement the report's recommendations and begin payments to the victims of this scandal. It's essential that people begin to receive the compensation which is so long overdue, and it is vital that this is done in the most compassionate and effective way. While we hope that the government will go further in ensuring the affected community are fully engaged and consulted in this process, the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme will allow victims, both those infected and affected, to at last move towards justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, can I just finally take the opportunity to thank Emily, Eleni, Pipsy, Claudia, Harry and Orlando, who are all A-level students in my constituency, doing work experience in my office this week. It's been a pleasure to host them, and they've worked very hard on helping me to put together this contribution to this debate, and I thank them very much. Thank you.
Lavery.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've spoken in this House on numerous occasions with regard to this desperately sad scandal, and I've raised on a whole number of occasions the number of people dying during what appears to be inquiry after inquiry, questions after questions, and I think it's long time due that we are at this stage today. Today's motion goes some way to allaying my concerns and the concerns of those still suffering as a result of one of the biggest scandals in NHS history. You know, this is a tragic miscarriage of justice. It's destroyed many individuals' lives. It's destroyed the lives of many families up and down the length and the breadth of this country. I've got the utmost of faith in my right honourable friend, the Paymaster General, and I know that he knows that many people believe that the proposals before us just don't actually, well, they're not complete and they don't go far enough. Hence the announcement from my right honourable friend that the second tranche of proposals compensation will come before the House, hopefully before the 31st of March 2025, which is good news, I must say. But there are then still people waiting and still living a life of uncertainty between now and then. We've got to make sure that we do step up to the challenge. I also know that this is the first step of a government acting within months of taking office, and that this legislation is the beginning of justice for those who I've just described have suffered for so long. And I've spoken, like everyone in here, I've spoken to many campaigners, many victims, affected, infected families, and my good friend and constituent Sean Cavins, who was infected with hepatitis C as a baby, has been a great help to me. But they have still got many concerns, Madam Deputy Speaker. I must say once again that the progress that's been made has been fantastic in the first 100 days of a Labour government. There is still confusion about the way the scheme will impact on individual claimants, those who will make compensation claims. There is also concern that there has been a lack of engagement generally to understand and act upon potential weaknesses in the scheme. There needs to be far more engagement, and I'm sure my right honourable friend will be taking steps to constructively involve the charities and individuals with an interest in this before the 31st of March next year. And I think this isn't just my view, this is the view of individuals who I've spent hours and hours with listening to their concerns. For example, the Haemophilia Society and other campaigning bodies have been absolutely fantastic, very patient in many ways. And as was mentioned earlier from the Honourable Gentleman from the SAP, these organisations really need to be financed from central government if that's at all possible. They've used the resources, they've used their campaigning finances every which way they can to try and get justice. Not only are they just totally exhausted, but they're exhausted of finances as well. There's also concerns, Madam Deputy Speaker, that whilst the core route for compensation has been laid out today, there's little information of the supplementary routes. And now that my honourable friend will be right honourable friend, I keep demoting him, I promise him I don't mean that. My right honourable friend and I will be acutely aware that many of those suffering from haemophilia believe it is the supplementary route that they'll need to apply through, and hope he'll be able to clarify in more detail how this may work in practice. There are further concerns on the level of compensation and the compensation paid to those impacted by the infection and subsequent death of loved ones. And might I ask how the initial infected victims for compensation were chosen? There's more than 5,000 registered and 20 before the end of the year. It does seem to be a bit of a drop in the ocean. And I wonder if we can have a clear timeline on how many claims the IBC expect to process per month in 2025. As we mentioned before, still one victim dying every 4 days with regard to this scandal. Yes, of course.
For giving way, because he highlights one of two fundamental elements to this. And I thank the government for what they're doing, and it builds on the work of the previous government in this respect. The first is information. Information to those families who are affected and the individuals affected. Now, clearly, the provision of information will affect exactly what he's just described, whether people come forward and whether the rate of payment is maintained at the pace it has been up until now. But the second issue is alacrity. You know, very often with these things, getting money out quickly matters most, because there is a rate of attrition. Let's not be macabre about this, but some of the people that are affected will die before they get the money. And so alacrity is critically important when you're dealing with this kind of challenge.
Thanks for that intervention, and obviously I've covered a number of the issues raised by the Honourable Gentleman, and I'll continue to cover a number of them as my contribution continues. There's other huge issues which are of major concern. You know, when I say that under concern, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is what's being relayed from the groups, from individuals who we've been in constant contact with. Some of the issues, and I'll just mention a number of them, refer to the £10,000 and £15,000 awards for unethical research and testing. They believe that that's far too low, and I'm going to come back to this one. There's no recognition of those with chronic hepatitis C who underwent interferon treatment and the additional impact that this has had on lives. Concern that hepatitis C payment burdens don't reflect the suffering caused. Bereaved parents and children will receive very low compensation payments if they're not the beneficiary of the estate or the bereaved family member. There's no compensation for the loss of psychological impact and suffering caused by exposure to BCGD. The list is endless, and I think the Right Honourable Gentleman has received a letter from the Haemophilia Society outlining the vast majority of the issues which they want to raise. I want to specifically mention the particular scandal of children being selected for dangerous medical research. Children given factor concentrates despite the knowledge of the dangers posed. It's very eerie. It's not British-like. This is being described to me as organised child abuse. The sums of money suggested, 15,000 or 10,000, to compensate victims seem paltry in comparison to the horrors this abuse has caused. You know, we just need to take ourselves back just a few years, and we've had children in Trelows, a school set up basically for people for haemophiliacs. And we've had institutions up and down this country experimenting on children. Doesn't sound like the UK, does it? Experimenting on children unknown to themselves and unknown to their families. I simply, really cannot get my head around this sinister issue. You know, I cannot. And I think there needs to be a lot more focus on what actually happened back in the day when this country, the great NHS, were experimenting on young kids. It's not just Trelows. Trelows has received a lot of attention. It's other institutions as well, up and down the country. But we need to get to the bottom of this, and as a country and a government, we need to send a clear message that this experimentation is wholly unacceptable. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know the government will be looking into this issue and acting on it with the utmost haste. It's absolutely critical that those who have suffered for so long at the hands of this injustice, the hands of the scandal, get the redress they so sorely deserve. And Madam Deputy Speaker, as we discuss this scandal, we shouldn't forget those who have suffered as a result. People like my aforementioned constituent Sean Cavins, who continues to be an inspirational campaigner on the issue, standing up for those who are unable to do so, and who have tragically those who have tragically lost their lives. Everybody in here will be mentioning individuals and their constituents who have been campaigning and done a fantastic job, and good on them. The Labour government has made giant steps to address this scandal. I'd like to thank personally and on behalf of the people who I've spoken to, my right honourable friend and his team, and urge him to consider the many outstanding issues before the issue comes back to the House on the 31st of March 2025.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm conscious of your warning about the subjudice rule, as there is ongoing litigation on this issue, but I hope and believe that nothing I'm going to say in my brief contribution this afternoon will in any way overshadow the prerogative of the courts. This has gone on for far too long, over far too many years. And I've dealt in particular with two constituents, who both of whom came to see me at my constituency surgery to explain to me, as their Member of Parliament, what they had gone through and how it had affected them. And it clearly did in both cases. So I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, the House will forgive me if I judge it's not right to go through both of their cases in detail. I hope the House will respect my reasoning there. But what I can say is that they were both extremely polite. I can say that they were both eminently reasonable in what they were asking for, but they were both of them deeply frustrated by how long this had taken. And I will now be sending them both a copy of the government's order this afternoon, and, because it's rather complicated, thankfully a copy of the explanatory notes, which I hope they will find as much use as I have. And I hope not just that as a result of this afternoon, they will be able to achieve some financial redress to which I am certain they are absolutely morally entitled, but also that they will be able to achieve some peace of mind. Because it was very clear to me that both of these people's lives had been very materially affected by this issue. And one of them said to me, "It's not about the money, I just want to be able to bring this to a close." And I hope that the House will understand that sentiment. And if you'd heard it the way that I'd heard it face to face, I'm sure you would have been as convinced as I was. But I also just want to say a few brief thank yous, because this has been, as we all know, a very long and complex journey. Not just for those who were affected by it, but for those who've had to, many years on, deal with the consequences. This was not the National Health Service's finest hour. And it took a great deal of campaigning by many people, even to get the system to put its hand up and to admit that something had gone wrong. In fact, dreadfully wrong. Had it not been for the persistence of some of those individuals, we wouldn't be having this debate this afternoon. But then someone had to deal with the consequences. So I'd like to pay tribute to two brilliant public servants, Sir Brian Langstaff and Sir Robert Francis, and there were others, who both in their own way have had to attempt to exercise what one might call the judgment of Solomon over this extremely detailed and complex issue. They have done, both of them, their country a service. I'd also like, if I may, to commend my right honourable friend for Salisbury, and indeed, although he is no longer in the House, the previous right honourable member for Horsham, both of whom, when they were in government, attempted to deal with this very complex issue. And I know in some private conversations with the right honourable member for Horsham, who I subsequently served with on the Defence Committee in the previous Parliament, that this is something that had preyed on his mind and where he'd really tried to do his best. And then the last thank you, I think, goes to the current Paymaster General, who clearly is trying to achieve a resolution as speedily as possible, and again, if I may, has dealt with this in a very empathetic manner this afternoon. And I speak really for two constituents, but I'm sure we all have them, and there'll be many across the country who'll be grateful for the way in which he is evidently attempting to handle this. So I wish him Godspeed in all of his endeavours. This went on for too long and affected too many people. But now, at last, hopefully, collectively, we can begin to put this right and give those people not just redress, but some sort of peace of mind. Thank you, Bob.
I know that a few members have just turned up and they weren't here for the opening speeches. If they can make their way to my bench, or to my chair, forgive me, so I can have a conversation with them if they want to contribute. I call next Jessica Toale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for all the work my right honourable friend and this Labour government has done to move quickly and to deliver on its commitment to provide compensation to both the infected and affected. And today we have the first opportunity to support the first of those payments being made. As we've heard from other members in the House, the infected blood inquiry revealed systematic failures that led to 30,000 patients being infected, and more than 3,000 people have died as a result of those infections. One of these was Jane Fitzgerald, the mother of my constituent Ronan Fitzgerald, who is here with us in the gallery today. And I want to make it a matter of official record the horror that Jane, her family, and other victims have suffered. In 1978, Jane was 17 years old, and she had an ectopic pregnancy and was diagnosed with anemia. Her GP advised her to have a small blood transfusion to make her feel better, and Jane was given just 1 unit of blood at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Boscombe. It wasn't until more than 2 decades later, at the age of 42, that she discovered she'd been infected with hepatitis C. Jane and her family sought treatment, but by the time she was able to find a suitable option, her cirrhosis was too advanced. Her infection caused untold physical and emotional damage and subjected her to numerous indignities, including the stigma related to her condition. Jane was told on at least 2 occasions that she was clear of the disease, only to find that her condition had actually worsened. Her condition caused fluid to collect in her abdomen, legs and feet, which required regular draining, and she often spent hours waiting for hospital treatment when there weren't beds or equipment to treat her. And on one occasion, her stomach actually split open while she was waiting for treatment, but she was sent home because the hospital didn't have the drainage equipment. Eventually, the toxins in her liver carried cancerous cells to her lungs and to her brainstem. Jane died in 2015 at the age of 54. Jane was taken away from her family in the worst possible way, and they suffer the consequences every day. Ronan has spoken candidly with me about the irreversible impact that losing his mother has had on him, and being powerless to prevent her untimely death has affected his mental health and caused him debilitating physical illness. Ronan is a British Army veteran. He served in the Royal Corps of Signals, but he was left unable to climb a flight of stairs or even leave bed. He was bedbound for long periods at the age of just 29. And in his mother's final moments, Ronan made a vow that he would continue to fight for justice for her and for all families affected. Thousands more are living with illness and fear, in the full knowledge that even now somebody dies every 3.5 days. When I first met Ronan, he asked me if I'd be willing to stand up in the House of Commons to speak up for his mother and all the other infected and affected. He has been a stalwart campaigner for the affected children and has strived to ensure that their voices and the impact of the scandal on their lives are accounted for, and he now co-chairs the support group Tainted Blood Affected Siblings and Children, representing 400 members. And while he's grateful for the progress that has been made, he has also asked me to share his concerns and be his voice. The community of affected children have called for the removal of discriminatory age restrictions placed on siblings over the age of 18 and not living at the same address of their infected loved ones at the point of infection, to ensure that affected children and siblings are not excluded from any heads of loss, and that all infected and affected persons must have equal access to supplementary routes across all heads of loss, where they may provide further evidence of their individual circumstances to ensure compensation reflects the impact and severity of this travesty on their lives. Further, payment to estates should be given the same priority as payments to living infected persons. Any process that delays these payments creates the high probability that some elderly affected members might die before the payments are made and due time taken to process them. Currently, there are no safeguards or protections from government should this happen, unlike the protections offered to living infected who die before their payments are made. Families have been waiting too long for justice, and they now run the risk of missing out on this justice and the compensation they deserve. The Infected Blood Inquiry report confirmed that Jane was a victim of medical malpractice for the single unit of non-life-saving blood she was given, and this was covered up for decades. Today is an important day in the long road to justice traversed by families affected by the infected blood scandal, and I pay tribute to the victims and all the campaigners who have fought so hard. I'm grateful that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority has agreed to meet with the affected children and siblings, and in the spirit of test and learn, can I please also urge the government to ensure that all efforts are made to deliver the justice to this community and that their voices are taken into account in all stages of the process going forward.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My very first contribution in this place was to raise the issue of the infected blood scandal and the impact on siblings in a question, as it had been raised to me directly whilst canvassing during the general election campaign. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity now to raise those issues again in this debate. We on the Liberal Democrat benches absolutely welcome the opportunity to recognise the victims of this historic failure. The tragedy of history is that we cannot change it, but the opportunity in front of this House now at least allows us to give victims and their families the recognition and the recourse that they have been stripped of for far too long by learning lessons from this terrible episode and ensuring that history is not repeated. The administration of high-risk blood transfusions on vulnerable children and adults, carried out by the very medical professionals their families trusted, stands out as one of the most shocking miscarriages of justice in healthcare in our lifetimes. The inflected blood scandal has left behind a wake of mourning families forever changed by the loss of their loved one. I would like today to share the concerns of just one of those thousands of families. A constituent of mine who lost a sibling to the scandal recently wrote to me to say that he is deeply worried that his 87-year-old mother may not live to witness justice served through the government's compensation scheme. As the Honourable Member for Bournemouth West has just mentioned, I strongly urge the government to go further in the scheme to include the families and siblings of victims who are currently excluded from support because they were over the age of 18 or did not act as carers for victims. That is a clear exclusion that I think we do need to revisit and hopefully can be included in further phases of the scheme. Now, no amount of money can ever make up for the grief, but it is our responsibility in this chamber to make sure that the British state recognises and begins to tackle historical injustices like this one with a comprehensive scheme. To make sure this scheme does that properly, the government must also ensure full transparency over its progress and open, ongoing communications with all those affected. Further administrative delays will undermine this vital work. This cannot happen, and I am reassured to hear about the work being done to expedite the claims and also to hear the dates for the opening and the first phase of the scheme to be conducted. The scheme is not just a financial obligation, it's a moral imperative. We owe it to the victims and their families to act decisively and transparently. Justice cannot be delayed. When the story of this scandal is told, let today be the first page of the final chapter in which we right a historic wrong. We take stock of what it has taught us about the failures of our system and provide, at long last, some level of closure for victims and their families. I do thank the Minister again for his work on this issue and encourage him to continue to refine and develop the scheme to ensure that no one affected or infected are left out or left waiting for justice.
Deputy Speaker, first I'd like to express my gratitude to members of this House who've elected me as the designated chair of the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. I say designated because we're lacking a Conservative officer in the group, so we can't register it in the normal way. And it's both an honour and a challenge to follow on from the excellent leadership of my... Oh, indeed.
Volunteer to fill that gap for him.
I will, and you'll be most welcome, and I will pass on that information. I was hoping to tease someone out with, by saying it. And it's an honour and a challenge to follow on from the excellent leadership of my friend and colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull and Cottingham, or Kingston upon Hull North and Cottingham. She's going to be an extremely tough act to follow. She's forced to stand down in this role because she was appointed to the government. Now, I welcome the progress that the government is making, and I welcome today's regulations. But the victories that were celebrated when Sir Brian Langstaff made his final report, and Sir Robert Francis was appointed to lead the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, for many, rather than being a beginning of the end, seems to be mere milestones on a path that has still many miles to go. The fear among many campaigners is that Cabinet Office, which was responsible for delay and obfuscation over decades, is now back in charge of the compensation scheme. I know the Minister is earnest in his wish to see the victims of this scandal given the justice they deserve. I know he understands that we are where we are because the campaigners refused to be silenced. They took on the establishment and won. My right honourable friend and I cheered them on and promised to deliver for them without equivocation should we get into government. And there has been progress, and we welcome today's regulations, but the euphoria for too many has been replaced with frustration, leading to anger and a growing fear of betrayal. And this stems from the fact that campaigners feel they are excluded from the process which they brought into being. Decisions they insisted should not be made without them. are being made without the openness and candour that the government is legislating for. This is an excellent opportunity for the government to show what candour means in public office ahead of that legislation. And this is particularly true around how the tariff has been arrived at. Now, it's like for the campaigners, it's like they won the war only to see those they vanquished put in charge of delivering the peace. There is growing unease that this is leading to the same tactics as before: delays, lack of information about how decisions are arrived at, lack of communication from the Cabinet Office. This lack of communication is causing people to look to small charitable organisations for advice as they struggle to understand the complex compensation process. Will the ministers commit to providing support to those organisations so that they can continue in that work as recommended by Sir Brian Langstaff? I understand that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority are starting to engage with the Haemophilia Society and campaigning groups about the process and technical matters. But there is an urgent need for much more engagement than has happened thus far. We are now told that it is the intention of the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to settle 20 cases by the end of the year. Why only 20? How will they be selected? The victims call these the Willy Wonka golden tickets. In the meantime, while these 20 cases are completed, another 14 people are likely to die. One victim dies on average every 4 days. Justice delayed is justice denied. Sir Brian Langstaff made his appeal to the government to get on with the compensation scheme when he published his interim report in April 2023, because he was alarmed by that so many were dying without receiving the justice they deserve. This makes it imperative that people, whether infected or affected, receive the interim payments without delay. Regulations for those affected by the scandal will not be published until March 2025. Yet another year on from Sir Brian's final report, yet again justice delayed, yet again victims will die without receiving compensation. These are people who suffered unspeakable harm, bereaved parents who lost children, bereaved children who lost parents and suffered bullying, bereaved partners that couldn't have families or were advised to abort babies for fear they may have HIV, siblings that were bullied, siblings that currently now under the tariff are being ruled out because they were over 18. There is so much more. It is not possible to delay these cases, to deal with these cases without understanding each individual's circumstances and the suffering they endured through so many years. What is needed is a bespoke system which meets individuals' needs, and that requires far more engagement than is currently happening. The lack of engagement with the victims is leading to a lack of understanding of how the decisions are being reached, how compensation is calculated, fueling mistrust in the process. Many victims, whether affected or infected, have lost their faith in that the full extent of their suffering will be recognised through the compensation scheme. Some campaigners have already concluded that their suffering will not be recognised through the compensation scheme and must return to court to get the compensation they deserve. Those suffering from Hep C do not understand why their experiences receive different treatment to those with HIV. This is a matter that requires urgent explanation. Again, the scale of the suffering needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. And again, there needs to be greater engagement for both sides to understand the concerns. Why are people with Hep C being offered much lower rates of compensation unless they are near death? Similarly, the additional payments for those experimented on of £10,000 or £15,000 have been met with widespread derision. My constituent, Mr. Lee Morey, was a pupil at Trelaw's school, and having read his testimony to the inquiry, I share his sentiment. Can the Minister guarantee that this will be looked at? We need to remind ourselves of the scale of this scandal. How many people have died without justice? That all along these people have had to fight to get justice. They will only believe in justice if they have faith in the process. That requires decisions to be made about them, with them. We have to restore their faith in this process. I understand that Sir Brian Langstaff has kept his inquiry open to keep a watching brief. It will be a shame if the Chancellor and the Paymaster General, or even the Prime Minister, found themselves summoned before him. Finally, my right honourable promise there will be a full debate in government time on this scandal. When will that be taking place?
SNP spokesperson Pete Wishart.
Thank you ever so much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, and he's also got another willing volunteer to assist him in the group, as he already knows. And I think he's absolutely right to pay tribute to our former colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Hull North, and I forget the other part of our constituency, who led the group with such distinction and energy in the last Parliament, and who was always personally responsible for making sure that we did have the legislative solution in order to bring forward the compensation schemes. And I also want to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Salisbury, who I think made a significant difference when he took leadership of this issue for the government after years and years of obfuscation and delay and dithering. The honourable gentleman did actually get grip of this, and I think all the campaigners recognise what he brought to the role. And I hope the Minister does the same, and I really hope that he does. It's been a good start. I think we all acknowledge it, and I think that the points that the honourable gentleman, the putative chair of the all-party group, is absolutely right. And if he continues on that curious and investigatory style, I think we'll be able to continue to make sure that we encourage the government to do the right thing by victims of both the infected and the affected. But we'll have to say this, I think it's with a great deal of satisfaction that we meet here today that we have made such significant progress, that we are at the point of actually being able to sort of deliver these schemes where we're going to start to see the payments of those who have so badly needed this support and compensation throughout all the decades. And when you look at and it's a pity we didn't get an opportunity, that's still my only slight criticism of the honourable gentleman, we didn't get an opportunity to debate this properly in the last Parliament. There was the unsatisfactory statement from the Prime Minister, who then just disappeared. I mean, there wasn't a real opportunity to sort of ask properly the questions. I know the honourable gentleman made an effort to address some of the concerns, but I think we really needed to hear more at that point just about how all this was taken forward. And we lost so much time with the general election. It was a massive gap, and all the activity and all the energy that had been all summoned up in order to get this resolved. But we are where we are. And the infected blood's final report, I think, was a fantastic piece of work. And I pay tribute to everybody involved in all that, because it went about its job so diligently and so comprehensively, and it was so wide-ranging that we did end up with a report that shed a dramatic eye on all the things that had subsequently gone wrong. And I think it paved the way in a positive way forward that is now beginning to deliver. And remember, while we're here, this is because so many people, thousands of people, were caught up in what is probably the worst health scandal that this country has ever endured. It is a failure of the British state that we ended up in this situation where people, through no fault of their own, contracted HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and those that were caring for them, when they raised these concerns, were constantly ignored and told that there was nothing to see here. And the inquiry was unequivocal that a compensation scheme must be set up immediately, and the regulations that we, of course, debate today are essential for delivering that compensation scheme as quickly and as effectively as possible. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been supporting victims of the infected blood scandal for about 20 years now, when it was first brought to my attention of a constituent of mine, a constituent that died about 10 years ago and is no longer with us. And I remember the frustrations of those early years where I was constantly writing on behalf of this constituent, just to be stonewalled, to be told that there was nothing to see, that there was nothing that could be further considered. And it was that type of reluctance to take these issues seriously defined the early years of all this. And I hope at some point, and I've said this before to the former minister, that we do get some sort of separate investigation about why members of Parliament were consistently deceived, and I'll say lied to, by people who were working in the Department of Health. We were constantly writing letters on behalf of our constituents, and we were getting replies that were clearly rubbish. And I want to know, as a recipient of several of these letters from ministers, why I was deceived in the way that I was. And tribute to Andy Burnham, he recognised this, and he actually signed lots of these letters as the former Health Secretary. But I want to know, how did that come to his desk? Why did he actually do this? But the key thing, I think, and it's already been mentioned by the honourable gentleman and several others who have risen to speak today, is the groups that are representing the community are properly listened to, that they are engaged and they play a part in the construction of these regulations. It's too late for these ones, but when it comes to the affected, it is the representative groups that have to be central to the designing of the new regulations. And I say that because they have a real-life experience of this. They know what the issues are. They have fought for decades to get to this stage, to secure this justice and compensation. I know there's a frustration with these groups. I saw the Minister screwing his face in response to the member for Eltham when this was being mentioned. But they do feel this, Minister. They are feeling that they are being ignored, that their concerns aren't being taken seriously, that they're getting generic, general replies from the Minister instead of detailed, proper responses to their issues. And I'll give way to him if he'll explain to me exactly why that's happening.
Just to say, he should read nothing into that facial expression. What I will say, and when I come to close, I will certainly talk in detail about the consultation that's happened, including during the election campaign when Sir Robert Francis undertook extensive consultation, which was the period of general election between myself and the Right Honourable Gentleman. That was hugely important. The government listened, has made significant changes to the scheme, and it isn't just about, he suggests, about generic replies. The government will continue to move extremely carefully, listening to concerns, and the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will do the same.
I'm really grateful to the Minister's response, and I'm looking forward to his summing up, and I know that he sincerely will address these things. But all I'm doing, Minister, is just reflecting some of the concerns I've heard from some of the groups that I've worked so closely with over the years, and there's a sense that they're not being taken all that seriously, and they're not getting the responses and the information that they see, that they think is important to the case. So I hope that changes. But you mentioned Sir Robert Francis, and there has been nothing other than glowing praise for the way that he's done his business. I know that Haemophilia Scotland just recently met with him a couple of days ago, and it was a useful and productive meeting where everything was there, everything was properly discussed. So there is absolutely no complaint from, I think, anybody in this House about the way that Sir Robert Francis has gone about his business. He's been up and down the country, he has met the groups, and he has listened to them. But there's certain things that only the Minister could respond, particularly when it comes to policy decisions, and that's why I encourage that we get debated him. And I'm grateful that he said that he is prepared to do that, and he's perhaps been misunderstood. But we need to ensure that we get that. And the community have to be given the information and advice that they require in order that they could do this. Now, there's a couple of issues which I hope the Minister addressed. I won't repeat some of the ones that I know he took a note of some of the things that have been raised, but there's a couple of things that I'd like just for him to address in his closing remarks. Sir Robert Francis, for example, proposed an additional autonomy award under the supplementary route for those who had been subject to this unethical treatment and the experiments being described. Where this is welcome, it is not clear how these figures have been arrived at. And I'd like just a little bit more clarity that how are these figures being calculated? And there's one issue that's possibly not been raised today, and I don't want to repeat any of the other ones that members have, and that's those with hepatitis C that were treated with interferon. Early treatment methods for the eradication of hepatitis C had many negative side effects, were extremely difficult to go through and had a lasting effect on those treated. So will that be a group that the Minister would be prepared to consider? And there's also the important thing about the future operation of support schemes. Now, it was a welcome development that there was a decision to continue with existing support scheme payments for life for those registered with the support scheme before 1st April 2024. Now, you'll know how important that is to me as a Scottish Member of Parliament, as we had a very effective and productive and useful support scheme that I think is now going to be included. But that's not going to be open to new members, and I'd like to hear just a little bit more to that. Sir Robert said in his report that the benefits offered by the schemes to eligible recipients recipients for financial and other support services should be no less than those offered by any of the current support schemes, and I want to know whether that's still the government's position. It's also assumed that, based on Sir Robert's recommendation, that all the benefits of these support schemes will continue. And I think it would also be good if the government was to confirm its position on early dates so that individuals have clarity over their future entitlements. And lastly, support to applicants for compensation. The Minister knows that he has the power under the regulations to make arrangements for the provision of support and assistance to applicants or potential applicants for compensation under the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme. And Sir Robert Francis has identified 3 groups that he could maybe usefully apply that prerogative that he has. And that's IBCA-funded legal representation, that's IBCA-funded financial support from an independent financial advisor, and that's IBCA-funded legal support to executors of estates where there are complex matters to resolve in determining entitlements and access to an mediation service. And I'd also like to add the point that my honourable friend raised about making sure that the representative groups are properly supported and resourced in order to continue with the vital advocacy work that they do on behalf of so many of the community. And I'd like to maybe say a little bit more about the willingness of this government to make sure that they're properly funded. The effort that these people have put in over the decades, sometimes a solitary exercise for 2 or 3 people, I think is extraordinary. I think that should be recognised as being part of the scheme. But I think that we are looking forward to the next round, and I think it's important that we go forward. I do have queries, and I know the Minister will probably address us about why 20. I've got no idea why it's only 20, and the putative chair of our group has mentioned that, and maybe the Minister could give us a little bit more of the reasoning and rationale. It's right that it's tested to see if it's robust before it's opened to a wider community, but I think he has to say a little bit more just about why it is those 20s. But I'm not having a go at the Minister. I think he's doing a good job, and I'm here more to congratulate him and encourage him ever so gently just to get moving along just that a little bit faster. We've had decades of obfuscation, of lack of progress, of people dying as they waited for the compensation. It now sits on his shoulders. We'll be watching him, we'll be keeping an eye, and I know there'll be regular updates to the House. And believe me, Madam Deputy Speaker, all of us will be here to make sure he is doing the right thing by these victims.
On Trickett.
First of all, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Minister, for the way he spoke to the House. He spoke firmly, he showed a sense of urgency, and he spoke with great clarity in his use of English, so it was very much appreciated. But the truth of the matter is that there is a deeply ingrained scepticism in the community which we're talking about, and therefore words in the end will not count, it will be actions, and of course today we are taking a significant action on the road. But when you reflect on the views of the victims and their relatives, it's hardly surprising that there's a breakdown in trust. It always seems to be the case that the British establishment's first reaction when there's a disaster is to close ranks, deny the truth, and not listen to the victims. And it's only in recent times, I think, that the victims' voices have begun to be heard. And when you think of the other disasters, whether it was the post office, whether it's the policing of the miners' strike, and all the other Hillsborough, it was always the case that they closed ranks. Now, the Longstaff report is very, very clear. First of all, he says, and this I think goes to the root of the scepticism which people feel, that from the 40s, governments of different parties were fully aware of the scientific opinion that these actions could infect recipients of blood transfusions. He says it wasn't a disaster that happened by accident. It wasn't an accident. And he tries to imagine what it must be like for those suffering the agony of being victims and then being refused the truth that a wrong had been done by successive governments. And my constituent, who has been in touch with my office, Katie, her dad died when she was an infant in the 1980s. And can you imagine living a life with a cloud upon you and the loss of your father at that young age from effectively negligence by operatives of the state, and then the cover-up which followed on. So In the end, I think the only way we can reduce the scepticism is when the payments begin to flow through. But in the meantime, I think that there is clearly some wish to get some reassurance from the Minister today. And he's said some of the points already, but I want to just go back to them. The first thing is this. A father who died when a child is 2 in the 80s, and she's not necessarily the most skilled at beginning to be forensic seeking the evidence, is going to struggle probably to find the appropriate evidence. And when Langstaff discovered, and it is quite shocking, that documents were destroyed knowingly by the government, the then government of the day, knowingly, because presumably they thought it might incriminate themselves. This was an establishment cover-up of some scale. How will victims be able to establish that they deserve justice if documents have been lost or even willfully destroyed? I think the Minister made some mention of that, but I think we need to hear more from him, either today or in the coming period. The second thing is the point that's been made by other members. There are lots of different civil society groups. The Haemophilia Society has been one. My constituent mentioned a group called Tainted Blood, and the Minister's probably aware of them. They have the confidence of the victims, and I think it would be helpful if the government and if the Minister could say that he's open and the government's open to further conversations with civil society groups, so that because they can speak on behalf of the victims. It is important the victims' voices are heard, as I've just said, and because they do have the confidence of the victims, I think those exchanges, that dialogue, will be very, very helpful. In his opening remarks, the Minister referred to, I think, one of the central requests which has been made. We're not dealing with people who necessarily have large resources to employ representatives such as lawyers and other advisors. And the Minister indicated that the government is open to victims having representatives themselves. The thing is this, though, and I'm going to come to this final point in a second, it needs to be clear that if the government is going to encourage those representatives to be appointed, that they aren't appointees of the government itself, that they see themselves as representatives of the victims, otherwise they will not have the trust which people need to have in them. And so this brings me to the final point. And I can imagine the kind of conversations which the civil service over decades have had with ministers about this matter. Minister, you are dealing with billions of pounds possibly, and you have a duty, Minister, to make sure that every single penny is properly spent. And therefore, Minister, please exercise care in any announcements you make. I imagine those conversations happen most days. Well, look, of course we have a duty to protect money, and very significant amounts of money is going to have to be spent to compensate people properly. But there is equally a duty to deliver justice to people who were treated in this really shabby and disgraceful way by state actors over decades, quite frankly. And I wonder how, where there's a lack of paperwork, where there are people who are perhaps very ill or even in the process of dying, we're going to secure value for money on the one hand to the taxpayer, but on the other hand, justice for people who have been really struggling as a result of government negligence for decades. So I'd leave those thoughts with the Minister and hope he can address some of them when he replies. Let me just make one final point. And other members have said this. I really hope that there will be opportunities organised by the government in the future as the scheme begins to roll out and we begin to hopefully establish some confidence amongst the victims, that what will happen is there will be further opportunities for the Minister to come back, for us to raise questions which have been raised with us by our constituents, in order that we can begin to establish a more trusting relationship with this government, which is doing dramatic work on this matter, and those people who have suffered for decades.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There have been many fine contributions by honourable members on all sides of the House this afternoon. and some of their contributions have been very detailed. You'll be pleased to know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that my contribution is hopefully going to be quite simple. There are two words that I would like everybody to consider. Those two words are urgency and trust. And those two words are the words that really summarised the feelings of my constituent, Graham Knight, from Burgess Hill in mid-Sussex, when I spoke to him recently. Graham isn't exactly sure precisely when he was infected, but he thinks it was probably in 1987, whilst he was having his appendix removed. But it wasn't until 2002 that he was finally diagnosed with hepatitis C. He told me that every day that he has woken up since then has been a bonus. And, needless to say, the impact upon his health has been vast, but also upon his professional life, his personal life and relationships, and his social life. In 2003, Graham lost his business, and the next year, as a consequence of losing the business, all of the family's savings were gone. And there's been an enormous impact upon his marriage to Sue. Graham and Sue are fearless, determined, strong people. And Graham told me that before he became poorly, they had 2 to 3 good years of happy, healthy marriage. I'm pleased to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that they are still happily married today, but the impact of Graham's hepatitis C has had a profound impact upon them in all those years since then. Graham said to tell you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Sue did not deserve that in her marriage, but she has been steadfast and loyal throughout. And Graham also has high praise for the team at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, who have cared for him and been incredible in the care that he has received. So Graham's asks are about urgency. He says that there has been a profound loss of trust among the infected blood community, and nothing will actually restore that trust until the payments are forthcoming. Victims need certainty because they can't plan for the future.
The Honourable Member give way.
I will.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way, and yes, trust and urgency is certainly something that my constituent John, who emailed me recently following a meeting between legal representatives and members of the IBCA team to get an update, and I just want to quote what he said, was big and elaborate apologies are not what is needed. It is what was promised regarding compensation settlements that we want to see actioned without further delays. It's clear the Honourable Member agrees with me, but I would like her to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for North East Fife for her intervention and agree with her that she is right, that making sure that this compensation comes forward is of utmost importance. And I'm sure it will be coming forward, but the urgency with which it comes forward is the key point here. So I would like to close by emphasising the anguish that Graham and countless other victims still hold and carry with them every day. It's deep-seated and it will not go away until this matter is settled and the payments are concluded. Urgency is now required to right this 40-year wrong. Thank you.
We now come to a maiden speech. Katie White.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to make my maiden speech today, particularly on this critically important debate on the infected blood scandal. I'd ask the House that you would allow me a temporary shift in tone so I can celebrate the community that sent me here. Like many honourable members, the constituency I have the privilege to represent, Leeds North West, is a new seat with a long history. I'm sure most of you know where Leeds is, but I always describe it right at the heart of the UK. I'm deeply grateful to the thousands of voters who have put their trust in me, and as I said on election night, regardless of how you voted, I'm determined to represent and serve our community in this place. I would like to begin by paying tribute to my immediate predecessors, both who are still members of this House. Stuart Andrew, who has been gracious and friendly, and for his commitment to our community, especially at Guiseley, and to my honourable friend Alex Sobel and his fantastic team for their commitment to our community and to tackling climate change. I'd also like to pay tribute to those before, Greg Mulholland, Paul Truswell and the late Harold Best, who all have a continued presence in the constituency. Esteemed gentlemen who have all fought for our communities and whose shoulders I am honoured to stand. But I do say gentlemen for good reason, because I am proud to be the first woman ever to represent Leeds North West. The place where I was born and raised, as were my parents before me. Seeing more women in Parliament elected than ever before matters. It matters for the women and girls across our communities. To Alice in Otley, to Navdeeb in Adel, and to Chloe in Horsforth. We've not had enough female MPs in my home city, but we're making up for lost time now. Leeds now boasts the first female Chancellor ever, so progress, friends, progress. Leeds North West has an incredible history. The stunning Norman church in Adel dates back to the 12th century and is where my parents were married, I was christened, and my grandfather lays to rest. Further west is home to Otley-Shevin. Members here today may not have had the chance to visit Otley-Shevin yet, but we wouldn't be here without it. The stone from the Shevin provided the foundations for this very Parliament rebuilt in the 1840s. Indeed, it shouldn't be a surprise, but it's Yorkshire that keeps this house grounded. In Leeds North West, our feet are always planted firmly on this bedrock, but our eyes remain on the horizon, ready to embrace the future. Our constituency is a vibrant hub of entrepreneurship and creativity, a legacy that continues to thrive today. Take Abraham Moons in Guiseley, a fabric company established in 1837 that still supplies international fashion houses today. Then there's EMIS, which began in the 1980s in Horsforth and now flourishes in beautiful Morden as the leading provider of data support to the NHS. We're home to West Yorkshire's only airport, Leeds Bradford, and I was pleased to meet with Jet2 CEO Steve just this week to discuss how the aviation sector can innovate to decarbonise. And should you wish to stop for a bite to eat, look no further than the thriving bars and restaurants of vibrant Horsforth. It's a constituency bursting with joyful community fairs and fetes, from Guiseley Festival to Yeadon Carnival, from Rawdon Summer Gala to the Arthington and Bramhope shows. The final one comes complete with a human fruit machine. There is no stronger pride than the Yorkshire pride, and our community spirit is a great source of strength. However, like many places, people are feeling overwhelmed and concerned about their future and that of their children and grandchildren. Many of the people I've met on the doorstep also feel let down by politicians, let down by the institutions that they have put their trust in over decades. The infected blood scandal is the most extreme and harrowing example of such systematic failure. People place their trust in doctors and the government to protect them, and that trust is betrayed. I'm proud that this government and this Prime Minister will introduce a duty of candour law to prevent future cover-ups like the infected blood scandal and indeed post office scandals. I also share deep concerns about the other great challenges facing our community. Mental health figures are horrifying. The Global Mind Project reveals that the UK has the highest rate of mental distress in the world and ranks second worst in overall mental health. People are working harder, yet are getting unhealthier and unhappier. And of course, the climate and nature crisis looms. We need things to change. The country voted for change, and it's change that propelled me into politics. My journey began with the climate crisis. We know that if we get it wrong, we face disaster, particularly for the most vulnerable amongst us. But get it right, and we unlock enormous opportunities for our society. In 2003, I joined the local Leeds branch of Friends of the Earth and launched a campaign for the UK's first climate change bill. Everyone told me it was impossible, too ambitious, too radical. There was no way the Treasury would ever allow a carbon budget, but friends, they did. We turned that campaign into the fourth most supported in Parliament's history, with cross-party backing from members across the House. And the last Labour government turned that bill into an act in 2008 under my right honourable friend for Doncaster North, who I am honoured to be working with again. Under this act, Britain decarbonised faster than any other rich country. This act has now become a global benchmark adopted by other nations. That, my honourable friends, is what global leadership looks like. Why am I sharing this? Because politics must be about real change, or it's about nothing. I want to serve our community, improve our schools, healthcare and public services. When I think about change, I think about my grandmother, Marjorie Symonds. She challenged the status quo. She lived in Horsforth in the 1950s, and there weren't that many women driving then, but Marjorie did. There weren't that many women wearing trousers, but Marjorie did. And when Marjorie developed breast cancer, most parents from the 1950s avoided talking to their children. Marjorie showed them her mastectomy so they could understand. She died at 43, the age I entered Parliament. Marjorie did things differently, and her spirit lives on in me. We've seen too much promise and too little delivery in recent years. Endless debates about challenges, but a lack of energy for real solutions. Politics should be about action, not just words. The seeds of change can be seen within our community. As a government, our role is to water them and create the conditions for them to flourish. Leeds North West is willing to play its role in full. We have the leaders, we have the ideas, and we have the get stuff done attitude that personifies Yorkshire. Like the students I met recently at Ralph Thoresby and Green Meadows, or the cadets in my constituency who are ambitious about the difference we can make. Like the Horsforth Shed set up a couple of years ago by ex-teachers based on the National Men's Shed model, supporting male mental health but expanded to include many other vulnerable members of the community. Like Otley 2030, who decided they wanted to be a beacon of hope and have created a living laboratory in the town to create climate-friendly and sustainable solutions where people and nature thrive. Like Brian, who after a death in Morrison's car park in Guiseley, set up defibrillators all over the community, so life-saving equipment is on hand and there is a network of community activists servicing them. And let's not forget the gold medal Olympians in our community, the Brownlee brothers and Tom Pidcock, who inspire us all with their dedication and achievements in cycling. We are indeed a hotbed of world-class talent. People in Leeds North West don't wait for change to come to them. They make it happen. They're the doers, the problem solvers. And I will play my role in that same way. I will champion the green agenda by focusing on practical solutions that carve a British path towards a successful green transition. We will leverage our strengths, whether it's world-leading research, supporting our best business minds, or unlocking the public and private investment needed to turbocharge a green economy. I will support the health of our community, mental health, physical health, community health, and I want to support our entrepreneurs and creativity to grow our region. I promise to be a ferocious champion for my community, my beloved Yorkshire and our country, and I will do it with joy. It may have become recently more fashionable across the pond, but I've been measuring with joy for years, and there's always a little more space for a little more joy. And finally, I promise to listen, learn and reflect. No one has all the answers, but all of us have some of them. I commit to working constructively and collectively. I will endeavour to arrive with curiosity and non-judgment, because if we want to change the way we do things, we must start in this moment, in this place, and with these actions. Thank you.
Having been a student at Leeds, I look forward to an invite. I now call Caroline Morden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Leeds North West for an excellent maiden speech, and I have no doubt that Marjorie would be extremely proud to see you here. So I would like to thank the Minister for bringing this motion to the House, and as my honourable friend for Richmond Park graphically illustrated earlier in the debate, the trauma of this shameful scandal goes way beyond physical suffering and indeed has passed through generations as people have sadly passed away from the infected blood that they received. So I welcome the government bringing this to the House fairly swiftly after the general election, because it is high time that this shameful episode is appropriately and comprehensively finally brought to some kind of conclusion. So I'm here today to put on record the story of a constituent of mine, Philip, who after 50 years told me that he wanted his story to be shared publicly for the first time. And I met his wife on the doorstep when I was canvassing for the general election, and she said that if I was to win the seat, would I raise the raised the issue of the infected blood scandal when I arrived in this house. So Philip was diagnosed with haemophilia B at the age of 11, and he says that by the late 1970s he was probably infected via contaminated blood products, although he was not diagnosed with Hep C until the late 1980s. Although very ill, he had a demanding job and a young family, so he kept working. He said, "The illness and the subsequent aggressive treatment with the then experimental drug interferon was only half the issue for haemophiliacs like me. The world was scared of AIDS and other viral infections, and the press and politicians at the time made it worse with doomsday advertising, 'Don't die of ignorance.' In hindsight, this slogan was a cruel irony, as we only found out 30 years later that our ignorance was engineered by those in power. As a haemophiliac, I could not discuss or disclose my condition. My boss at the time would not shake my hand or consume food or drink that I had prepared. I eventually moved jobs just to get away from the ignorance. I continued to keep knowledge of my haemophilia just to close family and friends. Philip eventually left his job because of fatigue caused by the Hep C infection, and even at this point in 2008, he was still not able to give true reasons for leaving to his employer. As an infected person, this has had a physical and mental impact on me for decades. The impact of the delays to the compensation scheme on me, my wife and 2 children as affected people continues. As a community, we have waited over 35 years for recognition, compensation and closure. During that time, over 3,000 haemophiliacs have died and more continue to die every week without knowing that their families are secure. I consider myself to be one of the lucky ones that has survived, but why are we continually subjected to more stress caused by government deadlines that pass and communications updates that say the same as the last one? The payment schemes are already detailed, so why is there any further delay? The latest delay is whilst the IBCS tests the compensation framework on a small group to check that it works. Does the government have any idea how this makes infected people feel? Some of us are guinea pigs all over again. I've used Philip's words here because I think they're so much stronger than anything that I could say on this subject myself. So while I welcome the Minister's statement and am pleased to hear that some payments have begun, I urge the Minister to ensure that progress is swift and that those who have been affected by the scandal will also receive compensation swiftly. And we've heard a lot from honourable friends here today about siblings and about the children of people who were infected. Applications must also open for the estates of those who have sadly not survived long enough to outlive this process that should have been resolved many, many years ago. And we've talked a lot this afternoon about the shame that this terrible tragedy happened in the first place. So I would just add my voice to the others in this House who urge for swift compensation for everybody who has not only been infected by this scandal but affected families as well, including siblings of loved ones who have died. And as my honourable friend said, trust is the most important thing. So we need to make sure that the scheme there is clarity, that people can understand exactly what is happening, that they can find information online, they can apply easily, and once they've applied, that they will then be assured of swift compensation payments. They will never get true justice, but compensation is the best that we can do in this circumstance. Thank you.
Yeah. Gordon McKee.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There have been many stories told of infected blood in this chamber in this debate so far, from the member for Bournemouth West, who told a story which is very similar to my constituent who I want to talk about this afternoon. These are stories of pain, of injustice, and ultimately stories of state failure. So I come to this chamber this afternoon to give the account of my constituent Brian and his late mother, Roberta Wilson Murray. In the mid-1980s, Roberta entered hospital to receive treatment for an ulcer in her stomach. Complications in that procedure meant that she required a blood transfusion, and on the 13th and 15th of July 1985, she received 30 units of blood. In those units, infected blood, which led to Roberta contracting hepatitis C. At that time, her daughter was just 10 years old, her son just 6. And even though in that moment Roberta's life had changed forever, she wouldn't know, because it wasn't until 2002, 17 years later, that she found out her condition. In a routine test for high blood pressure, she was casually but devastatingly informed that she had Hep C. And ever since that fateful visit to the hospital, for the rest of her life, she was in and out of hospital. And in July 2020, Roberta passed, just 2 months before her 49th wedding anniversary with her husband. For 35 years, her health was plagued by a virus which, for over half of that time, she didn't even know she had contracted. And when she did find out, like other members of the House have spoken about, she lived with great stigma in work and in her social life. The truth is, the state failed Roberta, not just in 1985, but at every single step of the way since. The scandal of infected blood transfused into patients is, as we have heard in this debate, one of the greatest injustices of our time. For more than half a century, tens of thousands of people, just like my late constituent, have suffered. They were let down by the very institutions that we are supposed to trust and rely upon most. Nobody would think that in an NHS hospital, the treatment that you were receiving would be a death sentence. But that is what it was for many, many people. And as is so often the case with such scandals, the initial injustice is worsened by the cover-up and the obstruction of the truth that follows. Whether it's infected blood or, more recently, the post office scandal or the collapse of a stadium, these injustices must never be allowed to happen again. It is, in my view, one of the core duties of a Member of Parliament to identify and expose failures in state bureaucracy. So that is why I think it is so important that this government will bring forward a legal duty of public candour. The pain and injustice that these acts have fostered must never be allowed to happen again. But the truth is, for families like Brian's, the damage has already been done. There is ultimately nothing that we can do to fully compensate them for the pain and trauma that they have endured. But we all owe it to the thousands impacted to make sure that the compensation process is swift, transparent and fair. I'm very pleased that the government has made it a priority to get this compensation scheme underway, and it is of course critical that these measures are able to pass through Parliament quickly. There can be no more delay. So in that spirit, I'd like to ask the Minister in his closing up if he could write to me to give an indication of when my constituent and his family can expect to see the compensation that they are owed. The Murray family, like everybody else impacted by this horrendous injustice, deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Manuela Patigella.
I thank all the honourable members for their moving contributions, especially advocating the stories of their constituents affected by this and impacted by this terrible injustice. And I welcome the swift delivery, or the pledge of the swift delivery of this important payment scheme. However, I would also urge the Minister to look at the losses of those family members who provided care. In many cases, like that of my constituent Deborah, who cared for many years for her husband Barry, bereaved partners and family carers gave up careers, sacrificing pensions and facing many additional costs. And the concerns about the care award has been raised by organisations like Tainted Blood, mentioned earlier in my honourable friend's speech. So a just care award must take all these factors into account. So can the Minister ensure fair care cost for the bereaved?
Andrew Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard some incredibly eloquent and moving and substantial speeches today, and I want to pay tribute to all of them. And if the Chair would allow me, just a particular congratulations to my friend, the Honourable Member for Leeds North West, for a fantastic maiden speech, a celebration of women in Parliament, of all her work on the climate, and of course, Yorkshire. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my first few months as the member for Welwyn Hatfield, nothing has left a greater mark on me than meeting Mike and Diana Blake. The Blake family are victims of the contaminated blood scandal who have been fighting with grace and determination for justice for nearly 4 decades. As I told the House in July, Stuart Blake, their son, was infected with contaminated blood in 1985 when he was just 6 years old. Stuart was infected with HIV and hepatitis C. He suffered throughout his childhood and passed away in 2006, aged just 27. Stuart was infected 2 years before I was born, but 39 years later, his parents are still waiting for compensation. The agonising story of the Blake family will be all too familiar to honourable members on all sides of this House, who, as we've heard today, represent constituents who have suffered both tragic loss and then seen the state close ranks about the depth of the crisis. As Sir Brian Langstaff concludes in his Infected Blood inquiry, a lack of openness, transparency and candour was shown by the NHS and government, such that the truth has been hidden for decades. Madam Deputy Speaker, those of us who sit on these benches today can never undo the suffering, but we can speak the truth about the experience of our constituents and demand that long overdue compensation flows to their families. In that spirit, I commend my right honourable friend for the decisive action he has taken since assuming office, and echo his recent comments on compensation when he said, "It means nothing if people don't get their compensation quickly and efficiently." I'd like to welcome the news that he expects payments to begin to be made by the end of this year, but also to echo calls made on all sides of the House today that from honourable members that those who are affected, not just infected, receive their payments as soon as is possible. I'd also be grateful for some further clarification on how the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will work with individuals and families to help them navigate the system. Specifically, I want to put on record my request that Mike and Diana Blake are assigned a dedicated caseworker, a single point of contact to guide them through the application for compensation and ensure that after all the years of turmoil, they finally receive what they are owed. Earlier this year, the Prime Minister said that as a society, we had collectively failed to protect some of the most vulnerable people in our society. He was absolutely right. The state failed thousands of families for decades, and whether they were infected or affected, the duration of their suffering is unimaginable. Madam Deputy Speaker, we can't ever put it right, but this government will have my support in doing everything in its power to offer compensation and, where possible, offer some closure to those who have endured so much.
Ian Solemn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and like others today, I welcome the progress on the compensation scheme. And I would like to draw attention, like others, to two of my constituents who've suffered and continue to suffer because of the infected blood scandal. Firstly, my constituent who was infected with hepatitis C in 1993, 2 years after the cut-off date for the infected blood support scheme. As she told me at my surgery last week, her life has been utterly devastated, and her sense of betrayal is felt even more keenly because at the point of her infection, all blood should have been tested for hepatitis C by law. Madam Deputy Speaker, she suffered terrible physical and mental illness for most of her life, including infertility, anxiety from the stigma of her illness, which is why I don't mention her name today, and the impacts on both her personal relationships and her career. It was a cruel insult that because she was infected after 1991 and therefore not eligible for the Infected Blood Support Scheme, that she's been unable to access the crucial help that she needs to deal with the impacts I've mentioned. So I do welcome the removal of those cut-off dates in the new scheme, but urge the government to urgently provide proper clarity around how the new scheme will work for her and others like her infected after 1991. Give them the details of exactly how it will work for them and when they can expect to receive the compensation they so greatly deserve. And secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to mention the case of my constituent whose mother sadly died from hepatitis C in 1998. In his communications with me, he has pointed out that the information available on the gov.uk website is very confusing, as others have mentioned today, and is finding it often poorly written, and that only adds to their frustration and their emotional stress. And understandably, his main concern is that payments to the estates of those who have died because of being given infected blood are deprioritised and won't be excluded from any heads of loss. As others have pointed out, processes that delay these payments will result in many elderly affected people dying before receiving anything. So can the government give assurances that those siblings and children left behind now and in the future will have the compensation safeguarded and will also receive what they rightly deserve? Thank you.
Emma Foodie.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And like so many today, I welcome that this government are acting to ensure that the infected blood victims receive the compensation which they have long been owed. Not long after being elected, I met with one of my constituents who is a victim of the scandal. He was a core participant in the inquiry and his case is referenced anonymously in the Infected Blood Inquiry report. Meeting with him and hearing his story has had the impact and the fight for justice and how it has impacted on his life and his family will forever remain with me. As a teenager, my constituent, who was being treated for haemophilia, went in for his annual health check. Asked to wait outside by the doctor, the doctor who he trusted was acting in the patient's best interest. The doctor informed my constituent's father that his son had HIV and did not have long to live. His father was tasked with conveying this earth-shattering news to his son. I'm relieved that he has defied the odds and is still here today, but let's be really, really clear that this scandal the word scandal does not do justice to what happened here to these people who were simply accessing healthcare. My constituent welcomed the recommendations of the inquiry and the work by Sir Robert Francis and the action that this government took immediately upon taking office to work to ensure that we provide swift compensation to those impacted. And he further welcomed the statements from the Paymaster General and the Prime Minister and they acknowledged that the state, through successive governments, failed to protect some of the most vulnerable people in this country. And this acknowledgement was something that was really important to him. Because my constituent and others, all those who have been referenced today and all those beyond our doors, both infected and affected, have waited far too long for justice. And it's welcome that following feedback, the government have made a series of changes, including the regular support payments, new routes for those seeking bespoke compensation claims and packages to those subjected to unethical testing. That the Infected Blood Compensation Authority has begun the steps to deliver the scheme and ensure compensation payments are made as soon as possible is positive, as well as that these payments will start by the end of the year, because victims have already waited too long. This can provide, as Sir Robert Francis has said, a credible means of offering significant and in many cases life-changing sums to persons infected and affected by this terrible scandal. And I thank the Paymaster General for his recent response to queries that I raised on behalf of my constituent and for the assurances that he gave in that correspondence, which I know were very much appreciated by my constituent. If I could just ask, though, for the Paymaster General, a final question which has been put to me by my constituent, and that is in relation to the legal fees that those campaigning have accrued, and whether there is potential that these will be covered rather than being funded through their compensation payments. Whilst I've welcomed the swift action we've taken, we should never ever have been in this position, and no amount of compensation can ever match the distress and the pain that this scandal has caused, compounded by the long delay in accessing justice. So I want to end just by reiterating what others have said today, because it is a testament to those, including my constituent, who have fought for decades to bring justice to those impacted. And I pay tribute to all of them, as it is their work that has brought us to where we are today. And I can't imagine how it will feel to finally receive the recognition and the acknowledgement of what has happened. And it is absolutely incumbent upon us here now to make sure that this happens quickly, it happens swiftly, and it provides proper recourse. And I hope that the action that we are already taking through the introduction of the Hillsborough Law and the wider duty of candour, we can deliver a culture change so that no one will ever have to fight for justice like this again. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I note the pointers to time. I will get through as many of the points that have been raised in the debate as I can, but I say to all honourable and right honourable members that my door is very much open. Please do follow up with a letter to me if there are specific points that you want me to provide a more detailed response to. I'm more than happy to do that. And I want to say, first of all, that we should always start in this debate with those victims at the forefront of our minds, what they went through and how long unfairly they took to fight for justice. And let me just say directly as well about their support groups as well, because a number of honourable and right honourable members have raised the excellent work that they do, both in terms of supporting victims, but in advocacy for them as well. The government will be engaging with them. The government will be asking what more support is required. And I know that a number of honourable and right honourable members have asked about that, and the government will take that work forward. Now, I'll try to move through the points on the basis of the order they were made in the debate. So I'll start with the right honourable member, the member for Salisbury, and he can certainly take my assurance that the government is in rapid delivery mode. He made the point about complexity, and I think it's a fair point that he raises. Now, of course, in addition to the explanatory memorandum, there was an explainer, there were case studies published on gov.uk. And I know too that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will provide direct support to each individual who applies for compensation. There will be caseworkers to seek to ensure that individuals understand how the scheme works, what choices they can make. Now, work is underway on the second set of regulations, but I will take on board the point that was made by the committee and the point that the right honourable gentleman has made in drafting the new explanatory memorandum and the need for plain and simple English as much as we possibly can. Now, I have set out a number of times in this House about payments beginning by the end of the year, and I know a number of members have raised the issue about the initial 20. Now, that is because the Independent Blood Compensation Authority is adopting a test and learn approach, that by taking a representative group initially, that is the best way they can subsequently ramp this up to be as swift as possible. That has been done with the objective of getting money out of the door as quickly as we possibly can. And of course it will be now for the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to build a service that balances speed with ease of use and of course data security, which I know would be a concern for the House as well. In terms of the regulations, the second set of regulations about both the supplemental route in respect of the infected and indeed with regard to the affected, I'm not saying they're going to be laid by the 31st of March next year. I am saying that, subject, of course, to the vote of this House, I want them to have passed through this House by the 31st of March next year. I want to move as swiftly as we possibly can with this. And that sequencing the split that the government has adopted in these regulations, the sequencing of the infected and the affected regulations was taken on the basis that it allows orderly implementation of the legal framework without impacting or delaying the delivery timetable for payments to the infected and the affected. And as I say, I hope, and I'm sure I will have assistance from this House in making sure we can get those regulations approved by the 31st of March next year. On the impact assessment, just to say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I may have misunderstood his point on that, but the equality impact assessment is on the government website, so I might have misunderstood the point, but I would just direct him towards that. And of course, with regard to cost, I'm sure he hasn't got long to wait now, he'll be able to study the budget red book next week. With regard to my honourable friend, the member for Newport East, she has been an extraordinarily powerful advocate for the Smith family, and I don't think any of us can ever imagine the pain of losing a child in the circumstances that they did. I hope she heard my reassurance about the work of charities and the work the government will now do to engage with the groups. I've also been asked the question a number of times about the next action, which is the interim payments for the estates of the deceased infected. I promise that will be before the end of October, and I will update the House tomorrow about that, so that deadline of the end of October will be met, and I will make that announcement tomorrow in questions. In terms of the issue of further opportunities to debate this, I've already promised, and we will have a debate this year about the progress on the implementation of the 12 Sir Brian Langstaff recommendations. Obviously, compensation is one of them, and I'm sure the House would understand why I'm trying to drive that forward as quickly as I can. But the other recommendations are hugely important too, and we will have a debate in this House. I'll give way to him.
Thanks very much for giving me one of the recommendations in the review and the reports was to establish a memorial or memorials in the different countries in the UK. Can my honourable friend give an updated report on where we are with that?
I hope to be able to make an announcement on that shortly. I've already said to the House previously how important I think the proposals for memorialisation are. That will certainly form part of the update that I give to the House before the end of the year. Now, with regard to the Honourable Lady for Richmond Park, spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, so I should congratulate as well the student she's had with her on the work that they did researching this for her speech. But I think what she said in terms of the culture of cover-up is really important, because what Sir Brian Langstaff said was not that there was some specific conspiracy between individuals. What Sir Brian Langstaff said is that there was something far more persuasive, more pervasive, that he called a culture of institutional defensiveness. That people and institutions put their own reputations above the public interest. And to tackle that, the government will be pushing forward with a duty of candour. But I should also say in respect of that, that in my view will be a powerful lever that this House can pull for change. But it isn't just about a change in the law. It is about leadership as well. It is about culture. And it's about changing the culture so that we do have a system where public interest is put first and we collectively minimise the chances of not just something as happened in the infected blood scandal, but it's happened in other scandals too, as Horizon, Hillsborough, two other examples, that we do all we can to prevent those sorts of things from happening again. Now, she asked, and a number of honourable members asked about the severity band. I do think it's important to say this. This scheme is tariff-based, and the tariffs were developed using the work of the Infected Blood Inquiry Response Expert Group. They were appointed by the Right Honourable Gentleman when he was the Paymaster General. They were clinical advisors, legal advisors, assisted by social care specialists as well. The government then chose to improve the scheme after the engagement exercise Sir Robert Francis carried out, as I mentioned to the honourable gentleman during the general election campaign. Now, the comparison between HIV and hepatitis C, which has been raised. For people infected with hepatitis C, there are 4 severity bands, and they are designed in line with clinical diagnostic markers. So recognised health conditions, for example, liver damage, have been informed by the work of the expert group. Now, it is correct that in comparison there's a single severity band for people who are infected with HIV. Now, the reason for that is that HIV is a lifelong infection, and the vast majority of people infected with HIV through blood products have experienced progression to advanced symptomatic HIV disease, including AIDS conditions, and have died as a consequence of the infection. Those who've survived continue to be severely impacted by the infection. And the view of the expert group was it was disproportionately complex and onerous to disaggregate that category into different experiences, and that contrasted with hepatitis, where there is a wider range of experiences, including both acute infections with limited long-term impacts and very serious and ultimately fatal infections. And that's the approach, based on the expert group, that the government has adopted. And similarly, on siblings, which I know a number of honourable members have raised, again, it is based on recommendations from Sir Robert Francis's framework compensation study. And of course, it doesn't exclude siblings over 18 who may have been carers and provided care. Now,
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. Would he confirm to the House that when he took the assessment of the June sort of engagement exercise that Sir Robert Francis supervised, that he didn't resist any of the recommendations from that expert group that interrogated this scheme, apart from, I think, 4 or 5, where he thought the government could do better. So there wasn't an attempt, either by the previous government or his, to resist the advice of the expert group who were engaged with the communities.
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and he took exactly the same approach that I did to the expert group. I mean, I accepted, as I told this House, 69 of the 74 recommendations, including, crucially, the continuation of the support schemes. And on the other 5, it was for reasons of simplicity, it was for reasons of speed, of getting compensation to people more quickly. So I hope the House will take the reassurance that there is that real imperative to act as quickly as possible. Of course, I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I'm exceptionally grateful for his explanation of how the different tariffs, if you like, have been arrived at. I think that really does aid comprehension. I'd just like to ask a little bit more about what did the expert group do to engage with the affected community to explain, as you have explained to us here today, as the Secretary of State, I beg your pardon, not the Secretary of State, the Minister has explained to us here today, so that the affected communities can better understand that tariff for themselves. Thank you.
As the right honourable gentleman and I have indicated, Sir Robert Francis did engage extensively up around the country, I believe, during the general election. But the point that she makes with regard to continuously trying to make what is an extraordinarily complex scheme open and transparent is an entirely fair one. I actually share that desire going forward to do that. With regard to the contribution of my honourable friend for Blyth and Ashington, who has constantly been a powerful voice for those victims of this infected blood scandal, I've indicated, I think, in previous remarks about we will engage with the charities and the groups as to what more support we can give to them. The 20 is about a test and learn approach to try to be able to ramp up and make this scheme one that is quicker. In relation to the unethical research, which was an absolutely appalling, dreadful practice that went on, again, the government has accepted the amounts of money that were suggested to it, but what should always be emphasised, they are not payments in isolation. They are part of, and will, in the vast majority of cases, be a very small proportion of the amounts of money that actually are going to be paid out. With regard to the Right Honourable Gentleman for Rayleigh and Wickford, who I thought spoke very powerfully, and I echo his words, by the way, about the former Right Honourable Member for Horsham, who I had a number of conversations with about this matter, who I know was concerned and wanted to drive the matter forward. And I thought that he spoke very powerfully about the two particular cases in his constituency and the need for closure, which I think is a hugely powerful emotion as well. With regard to my honourable friend for Bournemouth West, she spoke very powerfully, I thought, about Jane Fitzgerald, and she spoke as well about Ronan Fitzgerald, who I understand is in the gallery today, continuing that quite extraordinary fight for justice that he has been engaged in for so long. And I would say to her as well, she did then read out a series of questions. If she writes to me specifically with each of them, I'll ensure that she receives a response. The Honourable Gentleman for Sutton and Cheam, who is now sort of back in a different, same bench, but different place, again raised that issue of siblings, which I addressed a moment or two ago, but he is entirely right about communications and transparency. My right honourable friend, the member for Eltham and Chislehurst, steps into giant shoes, I think. Giant shoes, I think, with the former chair, or he is chair-elect, is that? Chair-designate? Chair-designate. Of my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North and Cottingham, who did an extraordinary job, actually, in terms of taking this matter forward. I would say to him as well, he talked about different government departments, and of course the reason that the Cabinet Office has led on this is because of the history of the Department for Health in the 1970s and 1980s. That's why myself and previous Paymasters General have taken on this responsibility. And he is right about continuing to engage the infected blood community, and that's a discussion I frequently have with the chair of the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, who I know shares that desire to do that as well. With regard to the Honourable Member for Perth and Kinross-shire, he was asking me about legal support. Yes, we've accepted that. He talks about my powers in that regard. They have been exercised. That will happen. I think it is hugely important that it does. We want this tariff scheme to be as quick and accessible as possible, and we want people to have that level of support. My honourable friend, the member for Normanton and Hemsworth, I thought spoke very powerfully about scepticism of state institutions. That's why I do think the introduction of a duty of candour is so hugely important, not just in respect of this, but other scandals like Horizon and Hillsborough as well. And also his point about document destruction is very well made. But again, one of the reasons for using a tariff-based scheme rather than having thousands of individual court cases is precisely because we can have a situation where the documents that are available can be treated more sensitively and treated on the basis of a balance of probabilities. With regard to the Honourable Member for Mid-Sussex, I thought she spoke extraordinarily movingly about her constituent Graham Knight, and indeed his wife Sue, and the support that she provided. And in this debate, it was also a privilege to listen to a fantastic maiden speech from my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, and indeed the first female member of Parliament for Leeds North West. Spoke with great Yorkshire pride, and she spoke about her constituents understandably feeling let down in the past. Well, she certainly didn't let them down today with that maiden speech, which was positive about the way that politics can deliver real change. I'm sure it is the start of a very fine parliamentary career. And I should also say, I think her grandmother, Marjorie Sims, would have been extraordinarily proud of her today. And the Honourable Member for South Devon, who spoke about her constituent Philip, I thought a sentence that he used to her really did sum up one chilling aspect of this scandal when he said, "Our ignorance was engineered by those in power." And I think that is a sentence that is worth reflecting on as we look at the changes that we are going to need to make beyond ensuring that people receive compensation. My honourable friend, the member for Glasgow South, spoke about his constituent Roberta, spoke very powerfully about Roberta, the stigma that she had suffered, and also in respect of the Murray family, if he can write to me about their specific circumstances, I'll ensure that he gets a response. I thought the member for Stratford upon Avon spoke very movingly about family members and indeed carers, which I agree about their huge importance. My honourable friend, the member for Welwyn Hatfield, spoke about the Blake family, and I think with the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, the work of the caseworkers is going to be hugely important. The member for Mid Cambridgeshire, when he spoke, I felt understandably that the first constituent he was talking about didn't even want her name to be mentioned, which I think is an indication of the ongoing nature, pervasive nature of this scandal. And my honourable friend, the member for Cramlington and Killingworth, spoke, I think, for all of us when she said it had taken far too long to reach justice, and she is welcome to write to me about that point, about what I think she's talking about, legal fees that have already been incurred. So if she writes to me, I'm sure she gets a response. Madam Deputy Speaker, all of us across the House must continue to work. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and I'm grateful to him for his answers. But notwithstanding his reassurances, there are still widespread concerns that are being expressed by those who are affected and infected as a result of this scandal. So would he undertake to or agree to a meeting with the APPG in his department to discuss the issues that they still want to raise?
I'd be only too delighted to engage with the all-party parliamentary group, but I'm sure if he sends an invitation in the usual way, we can have a mutually convenient date to do so. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I would also say that the honourable gentleman's referring to an all-party group, and I do think the spirit in which this debate has been conducted today is really important. I think it's crucial that that cross-party approach continues. We are dealing with people where the state has failed them, and we must acknowledge that. The regulations we are debating ensure we can finally deliver compensation to those who have fought so hard and waited so long for justice in the most harrowing of circumstances. They deserve nothing less. I hope colleagues across the House will join me in supporting these regulations, and I commend them to the House.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.